enjoyed lunch so far? Good. And it would certainly make my mom so happy that everybody's talking, and because we all know that she loved conversation, mostly her conversation, but occasionally she would allow for people to respond. I used to say that I had a 12-mile commute for many years in Los Angeles, which actually could take 75 minutes. And I would just call my mom on the phone, say hello, and then by the time I got to my driveway, I would say goodbye, and I never had to say one word. I got all the news and all the information. So, but I want to give a little bit of historical perspective, just some of my mom's story, and share a couple of thoughts. So my mom was born in November 25th, 1930, in the Bronx, to Howard L. Green. She was definitely Daddy's little girl, and always was, and Sarah Lansman Green. And she had a sister, Alice. She was the youngest, like I'm the youngest, and who she always referred to as her brilliant lawyer sister. Sadly, she died in her 60s from Alzheimer's, and she grew up across the street from Yankee Stadium. And she always said they could go up on the roof and watch the games, and although she wasn't really a sports fan, maybe because of that. She went to City College where she met my dad. Now it must have been fate because my dad actually had gotten into Cooper Union and was going to engineering school, but he was failing all his engineering classes, but doing really well in history, so he dropped out and enrolled in City College, and they met in a drama club. My mother was a dancer, my father was an actor. And they were married in Salzburg, Austria in 1952 on July 19th. My dad was there, he was in the Navy, and he was a radio technician, and then later he actually had told me that he was, as a radio technician, what he was really doing was, because he spoke fluent German, he was getting messages from the Germans and translating them so the Americans knew what they were saying. So he was kind of an intelligence guy, but he called it a radio technician. My grandparents sent my mom over on a boat to marry my dad, and she always was proud of the fact that she weighed 98 pounds when she put on her wedding dress. And the story is that the reason she weighed 98 pounds is because nobody told her the food was included on the ship. So she ate very little all the way over and was like this skinny. When they came back to the U.S., my mom worked in the settlement house in Cambridge, Mass., and my dad was at Harvard getting his PhD. And then they lived in Pennsylvania for a little while before they settled here in Wisconsin in around 1963, which is when I was born. And my dad probably only wanted one child, but my mom somehow convinced him to have 4. When we asked her about it, she said, "I manage." She taught 4th grade, other grades, but mostly 4th grade at Veeder for many years, and she loved her job. She left for a little while, worked for the Girl Scouts, and then got a master's degree in counseling, and then eventually ended up teaching again, where she retired. She loved to travel, and my parents went all over the world. I knew that they'd been everywhere when this was in like 2011. My dad said, "I think we're going to go to Estonia." And I thought, wow, you have been everywhere. I couldn't even pick it out on a map. I was like, Estonia? I mean, there's so many places to go. But that's where they wanted to go. I apologize if anybody's from Estonia. Estonia thing, but that was there. But they really had been everywhere. They instilled in us this love of travel. And we spent a lot of time growing up also going to the Cape. Cape Cod was a very special place, and there's tons of memories that we have from being there with friends and family, and being on the beach, and eating well, and just having that time. And and I'm so glad there's so many teachers here, because that was such a part of who my mom was, and my father. And my mom taught me a lot. She taught me that family time is important. And I like to say that we had the perfect family and the perfect childhood. Now, when I say that, I don't mean perfect in that everything was as it should be, or that we were always happy all the time. It was perfect in the sense of that mix of what life is, of happy and sad and angry and loving and warmth and who knows what. And I'm reminded that with my wife, who grew up in a very different kind of home, that she said, "Why are you yelling?" I said, "This is talking in my family. this is not yelling. You know, this is how I grew up. I'm sorry. If I'm yelling, you're going to really know it." So, but you know, different cultures, right? And so but I learned that. I learned to appreciate, as my sister talked about, you know, I appreciate food and good cooking and culture and music. In addition to the opera, my mother introduced me to the Beatles. So she had a wide variety of interests. But she also, you know, taught me about how to take care of myself. And sometimes by not taking care of herself. And she struggled with health issues. She struggled with depression. And it was hard to sometimes watch somebody who you love not be able to help themselves, you know, and not be able to do anything for them. But it taught me that when I needed help, I could go get it. And that's something that in my life today, with the work that I do and the people that I love, I pass on to them. So, you know, I just want to, and you know, by talking about it, by inviting them to talk about it, by inviting them to get the support and the help they need, whatever that looks like. And my mom was teaching up until the last breath she took. And I appreciate that, and I thank you for being here and being part of the lessons that she gave us. Thank you.
So I'm Katie, and tough to follow my siblings in their really warm speeches. But the first thing I want to do is thank my sister Emily, who did all the organization of this event, who reached out to all of you, who you know, understood how important doing this in Schenectady would do. So I really want to thank you. So in reflecting on, you know, my mother, I think, you know, you all knew her. I think that my mom was not a traditional mother in a traditional sense. She was she was a woman, you know, in a generation where there weren't a huge amount of options available to women. As a mature adult, I understand my mother a lot better. She had a lot of skills and capabilities, and I think being a homemaker, which was, you know, a very big option for most women, probably wouldn't have been her first choice. And when she looked at her career choices, they were fairly limited. She always told us, you know, you could be a nurse, you could be a teacher, you could be a secretary. She loved teaching, you know, she embraced that, but I think she would have done something very different had she had the opportunity. My mother had some very, you know, unique and special skills. In fact, my mother was actually a very shrewd investor in the market. She had a very intuitive feel for the market. And let me tell you, when Facebook came public, she called her broker and said, "Buy me Facebook." You know, one of the great stories, of course, as a daughter, is that I went to Wharton Business School, and afterwards I got out and I, you know, took a job, and I had interviewed at several places, and she called me up and she said, "Katie, I invested in every company that made you a job offer because those are good companies." Yeah, she made a little money. I mean, so that was good. So, you know, I reflect a lot about my mother, and, you know, one of the things she always talked about, so, and again, she was also in a generation where your husband was the breadwinner, and your husband, you know, had the ambition and was, you know, that was the world that she grew up in. Well, so one of the things my mother always used to talk about at the dinner table, which I remember influenced me hugely. I mean, I had no idea what it meant at the time. She would always say, "Oh, you know, so-and-so has such a big job." She kept talking about these big jobs. I had no idea what a big job was. But anyway, but it was a good thing, right? And I think that, you know, that fueled, you know, what I did in my life. And I think my mother in the end would have said, "Katie, she has a big job." And it was important. And so I owe, you know, sort of my life, you know, as, you know, so maybe she was a traditional mother in that way. And I think another thing I want to touch on is, losing your mother is always difficult, grateful for the wonderful life she had. And what I will say is, the world is a less colorful and a quieter place with my mother not here. We had very much hoped that my mother would make it to my daughter's wedding, which is in 3 weeks, her first grandchild getting married. At least she won't be there, she'll be there in spirit. But I think Emily said, my mother had very exacting standards, right? About people. And again, about her children, about her children's spouses. And Carrie, won the favorite son-in-law competition.
Not all the time.
But the other son-in-laws were like, we're not even competing, go for it. The other in-laws were like, but anyway, my daughter, is marrying this lovely young man, okay? And my mother was so happy, and she thought Jason, walked on water, and Jason, like my mother's husband, is a Harvard man, and when they got engaged, we sent around the engagement pictures, and he was wearing a suit, and he was a businessman actually, and my mother said, Grandpa Howard would have approved of Jason because look at how shiny his shoes are. And she said, you can always tell a man by his shiny shoes. I mean, nothing made her happier than to see her granddaughter with this young man. And the icing on the cake, and my sister tells it, that she told it to every person, standing, was that Jason happens to be a towhead blonde, right? He's a nice Jewish boy, towhead blonde. And she said, I could have blonde great-grandchildren. She was like very much, talking about that. And anyway, we're sorry she won't be there, but we know she was very happy with that. And the last thing I'll say is that, we were very fortunate in the last few weeks. Emily, Matthew, Sarah was out to visit, Matthew's daughter, all my kids, spent in the last week with my mom. And the greatest memory is that on the Sunday before she passed away, we were on the beach. You heard how important the beach was to us. My mom was eating a mocha almond chip ice cream cone and surrounded by her family. And so we feel very lucky to have had that. So anyway. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to hearing some of your memories as well.
So I get to tell Nancy's story too. So Emily and I met in 1996 on a double-blind date. We were introduced by 2-year-olds because their parents met because they were in the same playgroup. So neither one of us knew. Neither couple knew both of us. Anyway, so we were dating a few months, and Emily calls me that her father was taken to the hospital. He had back pain all night. And I'm like, oh shit. This is a little strong to myself. And I guessed correctly what was wrong. He had a problem with his aorta. And this is before they wrote all the HIPAA laws, so you called, you said you were a doctor, you could talk to the doctors, you could get a lot of information. So Fred is in the ICU, I think it's before his surgery. I call and I'm talking to the intensivist and I introduce myself as the son-in-law, of course, to make sure I got the information. So when I'm done talking, I said, would I talk to your mother-in-law? I'm like, sure. So apparently he says, walks over to Nancy with oh, your son-in-law's on the phone. And Nancy, in typical Nancy style without missing a beat, says, welcome to the family. That's my story.
Okay, anybody?
Don't feel like you have...
I'm going to tag on to his story because there's a funny story with my wife. My mom comes over to meet her, and she's a chef, and she cooked dinner for my parents at her apartment. And she goes into the apartment, and she sees this picture on the wall that she knows I have the exact same picture. And we'd only been dating like probably 4 or 5 months. They were visiting California. So my mom says, "What are you going to do when you're married and you have 2 versions of that picture?" Thanks, Mom.
Well, I met Nancy when I was in high school, and an old friend of Matthew's, so I just described earlier. And I didn't, at that point, have that much interest in, my friend's parents, although I always found her very engaging and always enjoyed her conversation. And so when I'd swing by on occasion to pick up Matthew, I would invariably be invited in, and we'd end up in this long, rambling conversation, at which point I'd look over to Matthew, and he'd have the, "Are we gonna go?" look on his face. And so this was very informative, for in later years, she would call me to do the framing on the artwork that she would find on vacations or wherever she would be. And I knew very well that when I set up that time to come over, and that I would block out the rest of my day. And that was time well spent. So if she was describing a vacation or where she got the artwork from, I'd get I'd get the situation, I'd get the ironies, I'd get the anecdotes, and if there was oftentimes that there was family pictures that she wanted me to frame, and she would point out the grandchildren or what their interests were, or what their passions were, and how they might do something with that later on. Or it was equally as possible that she would be talking about the passions or interests of a complete and absolute stranger, and how they might take those same personal passions and interests and where they might go with them. And also I remember him very, very fondly, and always feeling very welcome in the house. And I was only kicked out a couple times, 2 or 3 times. I got the boot, but it was always for the same reason. I will have come over around the holidays and be invited in, and we'd be in catching up and having a conversation, and she would enlist Matthew and my help in shelling pistachios to make the dressing for the goose. And so we would end up in these conversations until she looked in the bowl and said, "That's it. You boys are out of here. You're eating all the pistachios. There's not going to be enough for the goose. So I'll see you next time, Scott." And it saddens me to think that there isn't going to be a next time, but I'm just happily remember the look on her face. It just like this enormous smile when she was engaged in these conversations, and just fully animated. And all I can say is, God bless you, Nancy. We're going to miss you.
I'm the person that ate lunch with her for so many years. And I'm excited. I found out what year she was born. She would never tell us how old she was. Never. That was a no-no. And my husband said the first thing I had to say is, he bought a Saab convertible, and he came to pick me up at school, and he couldn't get the top up. And it was raining. So I said, well, Nancy has one. So Nancy came out and showed him that it has to be in reverse before you could get, and he didn't know that. So he told me I had to tell that. And I hadn't thought about the flowers until you were talking about her garden. When I went to Hawaii, she made me bring her home an orchid. Now, that's not easy, because they're kind of delicate, but I did, and I'm sure it's still alive, knowing Nancy. When we ate lunch together, I was hoping some of my other friends would be here, because we were such a cohesive group. We had so much fun, and there were little unwritten laws, like you didn't talk about kids at lunchtime. And on Fridays, we had a thing where you would bring in food, and we would take turns doing that. We were a great group, and half of us are gone now. We did have a grade level intervention, though, when she bought that espresso machine. She would come to school, and she would be this far off the ground. And we finally said, Nancy, drink it on weekends. Please don't drink it when you're coming to school. I like the non-traditional. I like the word unique for Nancy. I think that really described her well. If you look her up in the dictionary, that's where you find her, unique or non-traditional. But the thing I remember most about her is she always found your positive points, and she always told you. And you know, we don't do that enough as human beings. We don't tell people. She told me I was a great photographer. She was one of those people that would look at all your pictures from a trip. Most people don't want to even see them. But she made you feel very good. And I will miss her.
So as I mentioned before, Nancy was a very close friend of my mother, area watchers. And she made a really lasting impression on my life as well. I remember when I was a young teenager at Cherry Hill babysitting for the Jonases. She was one of the few who treated me as an adult. She was really interested in my opinions and my thoughts. And this was a tremendous novelty to me because no one was interested, especially as the youngest of 6 in a family. So it was quite unusual. And she was a rare person. She had just a warmth and sensitivity and generosity that made you feel like you were standing in a circle of sunlight. She was a longtime loyal friend of my mother, and I think this loyalty and generosity extended to our whole family, and it was lifelong. In my case, she helped me, it seemed to be at pivotal moments in my life, particularly in my 20s when you're struggling for what will you do in life. And she put in a good word to a friend who was in charge of filling a job position in a field I later went into. So it was just by happenstance. But she thought I would be perfect for this job. And of course, I had no such confidence in my ability, but Nancy went ahead and said that. And she also wrote an unprompted, glowing recommendation for graduate school in Fred's Harvard stationery. So I did. It's very impressive. So I did get the job, and I got into graduate school. And so I always felt that Nancy had a part to play in the path that I took in life. And later, as I worked at a store at Cherry Hill, having many South Colony School children come, including Nancy and her students, I really, in the notice of her death, it was the word beloved teacher, and I really saw that in action. She was truly a beloved teacher. So Nancy and Fred Jonas, both of them, I think are special people. Excuse me, I always do this, weddings and anything. So I was so glad they were in my parents' lives and in my life too.
I wasn't kidding that I was dressed colorful. I lived across the street from Nancy, and that was really and Fred. I loved Fred also. They could not have been more different. What a couple of contrast, each of them wonderful in their own way. What I like interesting people, and that's an understatement about Nancy. And I know Nancy talked a lot, but if somebody has interesting things to say, I'm all ears. And if she told you to read a book, you better read it. If she told you that a movie was really good, you better go. I mean, she just was this wealth of knowledge, reacting to everything, very emotional. I'll tell a couple of funny stories. I bought earrings from a garage sale, and they were old hippie earrings with coral and turquoise and silver. And every time I wore them, she'd say, "Why'd I ever sell those to you?" And then she was going through a period where she was spinning a bit. She was a little bit hyper at this point. She rang my doorbell and said, "You know what? I want those earrings back." And I said to her, Nancy, I lost one of them. I feel really bad. I'd love to give them to you. And the next time I saw her, she's wearing one earring, that earring. And that made me feel so special. How often can you give somebody something that they want? And this piece of jewelry that I'm wearing, she gave to me when she went to California. And then she told me, she said it's a piece of, she bought it in an antique Chinese shop in the city where they had very special things. She said, but I took the jade Buddha off of it. But I want you to know the Buddha's still there, and this is an exquisite piece of jewelry that I treasure. Nancy called me up after she moved to California, and she said, Mabel, I want to come and stay with you for a week. And I was like, okay. I was just a little worried how a whole week would go. She was the most wonderful guest I ever had. I will tell you that I didn't get a lot of sleep because her stories went into the evening. And she got into talking about her family. Man, you guys have some interesting roots. I mean, really interesting. And she made it all just charming and lovely. So I want you to know I treasured both your parents, but Nancy was really a gift to me. And I talk too much, and I'm emotional, and sometimes maybe I'm interesting.
Hi. I wanted to mention something from early on when I first knew Nancy, and something from this year. We were in high school, then we went to separate schools, but we still saw each other. And then she met Fred during her 4 years at City College. She was engaged to him. And then she finished, when I did, in '52. And I went down to the dock in New York, and she was sailing away on a French ship to meet Fred, who was living at that time, I think in Linz, Austria. And he was going to come, though, to meet her when the ship docked in France. And they'd reacquaint a little. She hadn't seen him in a year or two. And I said to Nancy, are you sure about this? You didn't see him in all this time. She said, I'm absolutely sure. And she was very eager and happy, even though her parents couldn't come to the wedding, her sister. She still knew what it was that she wanted, and she went on board that French ship with great expectations, and I think that she enjoyed her entire married life to Fred. And then that was the beginning of 2 other visits and living abroad. And I often wondered, she didn't speak Hungarian or German or whatever, how does she manage living in Germany and Berlin, living in Budapest? And then I realized that she talks to people with no regard to the fact that they don't speak English. She just talks about flowers, she talks about dogs, and somehow she makes a connection without knowing the language they're speaking, and they don't know it. And it's a perfectly good conversation. Unbelievable. The other thing is, at the very end, she knew that my husband, Morton, was going to be 90 in June. So a year ago, she started telling me about the fact that there has to be a party. I said, no, I don't think so. I haven't been well. Everyone we know is dead or half dead. No. She got after me and said, it's a special occasion when somebody reaches the age of 90. You don't just let it go by. You have to have some kind of celebration. She got after me to the point where I just said, okay. And so in March or April, I looked into trying to make, a party. And then Alyssa's wedding, which is in July, in Utah. And she's living in California. And June 9th for a birthday, it wasn't good for her to come to the birthday. So she said, okay, I probably can't come, but you have to have it. And sure enough, I'm really glad that she got after me, because we had a small party. It was great. Mort enjoyed it. And Nancy, of course, couldn't come now for two reasons. One was that it wouldn't have worked for June, and the other was that she passed away in April. But every time I think of this birthday party, I realize that it's Nancy who made that party possible. And I really love her.
And I would just like to add, of course, I would just like to add that even the last 2 weeks of her life, every single day she said, I want you to go out and get something for Mort. I want Mort to have, I want him to have a birthday party. Every single day, no matter how she felt. And so it happened to show up here today. With all her friends and family as my witness. I'm delivering this morning. Happy birthday.
That's truly amazing. A gift from beyond.
Only Nancy.
Nancy was a very unusual person, and I knew her for about 60 years. And I was very sad when she passed on.
I would just like, I'm sorry, sorry, I didn't want to say, just want to say something. I just want to say that Harry and Morton have been at, you know, many, many, many life events. You know, they've been very, very good friends to my parents and family. And when my mom actually turned 60, we had this surprise party for her, right? And I called Harriet, and we had this idea how we were going to get my mom to this surprise party somewhere in the, where was it? It was a travel. You had to travel there. And anyway, we enlisted Harriet's help to get my mom to that surprise party. And but what I didn't, you know, and they were a little late, right? And so afterwards, you know, my mom's, you know, we didn't know this. My mom said, Harriet's always a little late, you know, so I should have known this in advance. But I want to thank you for her 60th birthday party, for, you know, again, many, many life events. So I didn't mean to cut you off, Morton, but I just was reminded of that. You've traveled very far off.
This is a great segue for me, if I may. Unlike Mortimer, I probably knew Nancy the least amount of time. I don't think I've even known Nancy 10 years now that I think about it. But I was having a artist reception right across the Mohawk here in the Stockade, at the Stockade Inn. And Nancy and Fred walked in. And Nancy made the party because, like we've all discussed this evening, or this afternoon, Nancy knew something about art. She knew a lot about art. And I was fortunate because she loved my paintings. So she got to know me, she studied me, she'd find out who I worked with and everything. And then she took my hand, and I thought she was Italian. Because like Italians, she did everything with her hands, she touched you. And now we live in an age where you can't touch anybody. And she touched me like she knew me, and she took me, and she said, and where did you paint this? Oh, it's beautiful, I love your colors in that. And we walked all the way around the room, and I fell in love with this woman. This is what an artist dreams of, somebody that wonders about each piece. And she can tell you, oh, that looks a little bit like Monet, this is a little bit from more, you know, and she would just go on and on and on. But I love Nancy, even though I didn't know her a long time. And she commissioned me to do her garden, actually. And it's kind of tough for me because I went to her house, and it was like a museum, you know. And you go all through the house, and she would, just like my painting, she would talk to you about each piece and educate you. And it was fantastic. So I'm sorry. It's an emotional thing. And I'm emotional. I'm like Mabel, you know. It was colorful, and I found somebody that was like my ilk, you know. So I went down to her house, and The kitchen was done, by the way. The house was beautiful, and I was, I was very happy. So I was documenting the garden because I guess Nancy was moving to California, and she wanted to have her garden memorialized in a painting, and that honor fell on me. So I was there, and I was documenting it, and I get this frantic call from Nancy one evening, and of course this is when, her husband fell and everything, and it was just tragic for me. So unfortunately, I finished the painting, I got it done, but Nancy was already out in California, so I mailed it to her, and I never saw her again. So it's so nice to be here and tell you the story because Nancy was very special to me. Thank you.
I just tag on that. So that painting, when we were sort of going through things in the house, there was this letter that she left, and she referenced that painting.
Yeah, I got some of the story today.
Oh, you did? Okay, all right. Well, anyway, but it was we had to figure out which one. Was this, there were a lot of gardens and paintings. So when she said the garden, we didn't know which garden it was referring to, so we had to go through.
Well, it was just like when she was at my art show, Nancy was long-winded and she knew something about everything. But I found this fascinating, I was glued to every word because if her house was like a museum, and if she'd say, do you know anything about this artist? And I'd say, no, I'm really not familiar with this artist. She would give you the background. And I wasn't bored. I mean, there were paintings under the stairwell, there were, pieces all over. And we went the whole length of the house, right out into the back patio, overlooking the garden. And then she said, oh, Charles, take my arm. We have to go through the garden. And she would tell me each plant. We got to the cherry tree, and she explained, well, Fred got me the tree, and we did a graft. And she explained everything. And then there was this weather vane. You have to put this in the painting, Charles. And of course, that was the horse and jockey and everything. So I had this, it was almost a dilemma because I had so many things to put in a small watercolor. But I tried to do them, and I contacted Nancy, and I said, I gave this a little more prominence. She said, oh yeah, that's fine. And we worked it out. But I'm glad it's still in the family. I'm glad you guys still have it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm just going to speak briefly because I was Katie's high school friend, and so I just knew Mrs. Jonas. I would never have called her Nancy. And I was from a pretty quiet family, but when I would visit Katie, it was just like a whirling dervish. I have also had the tour through the garden. But I think what I'd like to say, which I don't think anybody has said, is that the Jonases were also tall, with the exception of your mom. And she was just the biggest person in the room, regardless of her stature. So that's what I remember.
I'm going to I made a couple notes on my phone of pulling things together because I mentioned before my parents and Fred and Nancy knew each other their whole lives, and Harry had something to do with that, I think. Well, these two had something to do with my parents getting together. I don't know, it's all ancestral. So, a few things. I'll echo that. It was a loud house, except when they were talking to Patience, the beloved dog. That was the softest tones for Patience. I love that Mom was Toots.
Oh yeah, we can say that.
Yeah, Tootsie was Toots, right?
Toots.
Right.
If anyone knows the reason why, my dad called her Toots forever.
I remember a very specialized chore chart in your house. Yeah, I do remember the garden. Like when the indoor garden, basically all the plants, some cactuses, and the 2471 Hilltop Lane house. Because I wrote a lot of pen pal letters there over the years. So the managing thing you said, how she managed. One way I saw her manage was they would go to the Cape. I think we visited you on the Cape once. We never actually spent a week with you, but then she'd come back and go to Marshall's. The original Marshall's was in Bedford, Massachusetts, one town away from where I grew up in Lexington. And I just watched her buy like $200 worth of clothes. This is now 1970 I'm talking about. For all of, for the children, piles of 6 for Andrew, 6 for Matthew, this whole pile of clothes.
Well, there was no sales tax. So that was their big thing. So they were like, go here, you buy all our clothes for school on that trip on the way back from the Cape and load up the entire store.
I remember being astonished by that. And that's like the only place I can shop still. And the earring things, Mabel, so the last time I saw Nancy was last year at Alyssa's engagement party. And so when I picture Nancy, I just see her talking at me, to me, or my mother, whatever. But she was wearing this really cool, it was a neat sort of asymmetrical haircut. And she had this earring, and I don't know. She said, "Yeah, I love this earring." And then she showed me that she didn't have the other earring. And she said, "Well, you don't need it because people only notice as soon as they see the earring on your left side, then they don't notice it from or the other way around." And then I say thank you to your parents because when my sister was at Union as a student, her and struggled a little bit from time to time, a home away from home was always your parents' house. So that was very meaningful. So thank you very much.
At the invitation that everyone got to the luncheon, the picture of my mother, that's the one to look for the earring. That was the outfit she described. Go ahead.
I met Nancy and Fred when they bought their house in the Stockade, I believe, I think it was 1985. And I was the guy around town that did small odd jobs. And I one time moved furniture from I think Emily's New York City apartment and dropped some pieces off at Kate's Connecticut house, and then brought pieces from there to Mrs. Green had moved into assisted living, I believe, in Albany. So I dropped pieces off there, and on the last part of the leg of that move, Fred helped me load. Actually, I stopped at their house and loaded some stuff. And things were a little wobbly in the back of the truck, so I said, well, can we use these cushions to just prop these pieces up? And he took a step back and he looked at me, he said, "These are from a Mies van der Rohe sofa." I'm thinking, the next day I go to the library and ask guy. So, just everything was, it was just all good stuff. And then I did some painting for them and some other odd jobs. And I just really appreciated Fred and Nancy. And when Fred passed away, Nancy moved to California, and we loaded up the truck and drove that to California and spent 5 days with Nancy out there unpacking and just spending quality time with her. And I do have a little funny story about Nancy and talking, which I always love to engage, and she with me as well. But one time she had a plumber at the house when I was painting. And she got the plumber in the back room, and she's just talking away and talking away. Well, 3 days later, she gets a bill in the mail, and he had tacked on 3 hours. So his bill, and she was on like, I've never been charged for
Everybody reminds me of things that Nancy talked to me about, and I just want to touch on this Cape Cod thing, which keeps coming up. She found out that we summered in Cape Cod frequently too, and then in her stream of consciousness way, she would find out where you went and what you liked about it, and then she would tell you, these other places. Have you ever been to this pottery place? And I think somewhere I still have this place. You've got to go, Charles. It's off the beaten path, but you take this road and you make a left, and you can't miss it. It's right there, this pottery place. And I haven't been there yet, but Nancy's going to live on, because one of these days we're going to get off and we're going to go find this pottery place. And that's just, you guys brought that up with the Cape Cod story. We go there too, and she told us where we can go eat, where you should go, and you got to go see this. And I remember it, and if I couldn't remember it, I wrote it down. It was great.
I have just a couple of memories of my mom talking on the phone to Nancy, and it would be a certain kind of conversation that was sort of surrealistic in the leaps that you know, the way they would finish each other's sentences, that was really something. So I mostly got to know Nancy by being my mom's son, and
Who is
Jay Waters,
our brother.
And one of the things that I saw from other people is that Nancy was so supportive. And I remember now, she, when I was about 16, she bought a little drawing from me. And that meant a lot. It meant that, oh, you know, somebody appreciates it, besides my mother. And so that was good. And then many years later, when I was out of a job and divorced, Nancy invited me over to the house, and one of the stated purposes was that I was supposed to meet a very eligible young woman. And although that didn't work out, that was just the type of thing that Nancy could do so well. So I sort of feel that her spirit is here, and I should be friends with everybody here because you knew and loved Nancy.
I won't be the only sibling not to say something, so I'll say something. I want to say that when I only babysat once, it wasn't that I was fired. I moved away to college or whatever at that point in time. So I saw Fred and Nancy when various times I'd come back and they'd be around, and they were really good friends to her, particularly after our father died. They really became family with our mother, and that was so wonderful for her. They invited her to Budapest with them, and they went to Turkey together for a side trip there. And the thing that I appreciated perhaps even most of all of that is when our mother was starting to experience some problems with old age and loss of memory and that kind of thing, and went into a assisted living place. None of her friends came to visit her at that time, and she was only a person you could give to at that time. She wasn't able to give back very much. But Fred and Nancy were the ones that came. And we really appreciated that as a family, that they didn't forget it.
I didn't think I would speak. I'm also a crier, so you might not understand me. So, one of the things that I really remember and loved about my grandma is, I'm sorry, sort of, she had these things, like, these things she would do that were like, I mean, I say this very, like, really completely ridiculous.
Nancy, never.
Like, well, for one thing, she's the only person that I think would ever, after 40 years of having, like, silver hair, would dye it blonde. For one second, but still. And, you know, I remember, and when we would go to Cape Cod, we'd go to, like, different places. And she'd sit on a bench and start talking to some random person and would, you know, talk their ear off for like 40 minutes, and we'd be just standing there like looking at our watch like, oh my god. And she'd often she'd make like a sweeping declaration and then very, very loudly, like, not apologize, I'd like be, not like bothered by it, but I'd be like when I was, I think, 9, she's like, you have to name your child Zuzu, and I'm like, and then she'd like, you know, like, I mean, it was speaking, but it was like in a very like yelling way, in the way that she would talk often. But yeah, and I think this last year when I was in college, she like sent me this care package that had #1 canned chicken, which I thought was very funny. These like succulent leaves from our garden, assuming that I'd figure out how to plant them, and I actually did, but I ended up killing them. But when I last visited her, I took lots of cuttings from her garden, and since she's died, I've actually found one can actually, you know, take care of a plant for once, so it's been
Sarah reminded me of a story about my mom talking to strangers, which you probably don't know, but she, my dad took us on a trip, we all went to see Niagara Falls. And I don't know, we were young, I was like maybe 10 years old. And we went to Niagara Falls and we went down behind the falls, as you do, right? But my mom wanted to stay up and probably smoke at the top and talk to people, so she didn't want to come, so we all went down. It takes like an hour by the time you go down, and you walk around, you do the whole thing, you go back up. So we come up, and it's an hour or so later, and my mom is talking to this young man from Britain. His name was Tony Biggins. And she has already invited him home to come with us in our car to stay at our house, to paint our house, and which he did. So he stayed there for the whole summer, painted our house over 2 months, and then, you know, went about, this was in, you know, like I said, this was probably like early 70s, so maybe things were different then, but he came to our house, he stayed at our house, we named our cat after him. Biggins the cat, we got a cat at that time, and we named it after him, and it was just, you know, that was a random stranger that she brought into our lives.
Unfortunately, wasn't a serial killer.
Yeah,
By the time he got back from the falls, she promised him all that, plus that she was going to fix him up with his first American blind date. I don't even know if he'd ever been on a date ever in his life, which he did also. And we dropped him off. We were headed up to Cape Cod, and he wanted to go to Boston. So after, I don't know exactly how long he was there, but we dropped him off. We said goodbye, and guess what? Never heard from him again. Now, was it because he was 18 or 19, having a good time? Was it because he thought my mom was interesting? I don't know. But that was the end of that story.
That's another profession of hers, I guess, because she set me up with blind dates.
Oh, yeah, I don't think she ever got it right, though. But,
so I've been known Emily since middle school, and that's when I met Fred and Nancy. And I had very traditional parents. They probably never went far to Nova Scotia. And so meeting Fred and Nancy was like being exposed to like a whole new world. And so, you know, I just always had fond memories of going over there and talking to Nancy, and the art and the food, and just it was just a whole different world, and much more cosmopolitan fun than the one I was exposed to. But I also remember as a kid getting postcards from Emily in the summer. I was stuck in Schenectady, and of course Fred and Nancy and her family were in the Cape, or they're in Germany, or they're in Europe, or just all these, you know, wonderful places that they went to throughout the time. And of course, I think a lot of you know Nancy was also a gourmet cook. And as a kid, I mean, Emily and I talked just about every day because, you know, Nancy has some qualities that are living on in all her children, grandchildren. And so, as unique a spirit as she was, it's living on, don't worry. And I just, you know, remember Emily saying, God, you know, my mother's cooking squid in its own ink again. And I had meat and potatoes every night, so again.
She still doesn't like squid.
This was not my world. And so over the years, I would always hear about Fred and Nancy and their travels, and, you know, what Harriet said reminded me that Emily said, oh, you know, my parents were in Budapest. And I was like, wow, that's great, because, you know, her father was on sabbatical, and I said, but, you know, and she's like, yeah, my mother has all these friends, and she's having a great time, and I'm like, wow, do they speak Hungarian? And then, and Emily's like, no, none of them speak each other's language, but they talk for hours, and there's just, you know, there's just no problem. And, you know, and so I always heard more, you know, stories over the years of the travels, and even after Fred passed away, of course, you know, Nancy just kept traveling and, you know, being adventurous and doing her thing, and, you know, just such an amazing person. And, you know, again, you know, going over to their house, and as everybody knows, at some point you sit down with Nancy and you just go on this wild ride of, you know, furniture pieces and grandchildren and you know, art and music and theater, and, you know, again, it like always, it was just amazing person and unique spirit. But I would say, you know, the last thing that I got from Emily was the pictures when her children had visited her out in California, you know, that was close, you know, and it was just 2 days, I think, before she passed. And I mean, she had this ebullient smile, and she was, you know, surrounded by flowers and her children. She looked 30 years younger than her age, and just ready for adventure and just full of life. And, you know, that's how I'll always remember her. It was,
I think it's also worth mentioning she had like the best memory of maybe like anyone I've ever met in my entire life, including myself. And would like go on, well, at least to me, she'd often go on these like long tangents about like the issues she had with people from like 60 years ago, and I was like,
And she'd always tell, like, if you didn't call her back, or she hadn't seen you and she was expecting to see you, she would always say to us, "Have you seen her? Because I haven't. Have you heard from him? Because I haven't." She always said that. Well, anyway, this is so looking for anyone's memories, if anyone else wants to weigh in or tell us, I don't know, whatever.
No pressure.
Because I think there's some themes here, by the way. Yeah.